skaters, welcome back. I'm so glad you're here. I am Coach Julia, and in today's video, we are going to be recreating my first ever figure skating dress. It's one that I made for my first skating competition, which I had back in the mid-90s. So this is the dress we are going to be trying to recreate. It's my first one, and sadly, it's the only one I no longer still have. At one point, I decided I was going to try to kind of fix it up to still fit me because I've gotten a little bit taller, and it never got put back together, and somewhere along the line got lost. So this beautiful dress is pretty simple. I had this pattern made just for me, so I contacted a company that's local to my area called Specialty Sportswear and sent them a drawing of what I wanted my skating dress to look like and my measurements, and they made a pattern for me and sent it back. And to be honest, I have been using that exact same pattern for every one of my dresses ever since. I just take that pattern and make changes to it. So if I want to change the neckline, I change the neckline. I'll change the skirt, I'll add sleeves, I'll change the sleeves. So I have been using that pattern as a template for years, but I'm going to go back and get the original, and we are going to use it to make this exact dress. Now, for this dress that we're making today, there are a couple changes I need to do. One is I'm just about an inch taller than I was in my teens, and so I'm going to make the torso, the bodice part of this dress, just a little bit longer. The other thing was, when I made this dress, I had no idea Swarovski crystals or any crystals existed. They weren't as big of a deal back then. People were wearing them, but it wasn't common. So I used this sequin trim to go around the neckline and around the hips. The problem is that sequin trim didn't stretch. That was fine around the neckline, but when I tried to get it up over my hips, I almost tore the dress every single time I put it on. So instead of sequin trim, we're going to be replacing that with Swarovski. So there's two changes: a little bit of length, I'm adding some length to it, and I'm replacing those sequins with Swarovskis. Okay, let me go grab all my supplies and we'll get started. So I've got my supplies together. The first thing we have is the sewing pattern. So this is that original sewing pattern, that custom one that I had made for me back in the mid-90s. I also have 4-way stretch black fabric. This I get from a company called Spandex House, and I can post a link to that website in the description down below. I also have a 4-way stretch mesh fabric that I'm going to use for the skirt and a little accent around the neck. This is also from Spandex House. Next, I have a 22-inch invisible zipper in black to match my fabric. I've got two different kinds of elastic. One is a 1/4-inch elastic that I'm going to use around the panty line, and the other is like an oval thin elastic that I'll use on the finger. I've got my scissors and my pins. Now, let's get into that sewing pattern. This pattern has all the directions. I've checked out their website. They're currently still making patterns, and they have a booklet just like this with all the directions. This pattern is really beat up. Look at how torn up this front panty pattern is. Oh my goodness, I should probably make a duplicate. Here is the bodice back. Again, we're going to add a little bit to the length to accommodate for my height. And I see a note up here that says I need to add a seam allowance to the top. So that's a good reminder. I'll add that when I cut the pattern piece out. We've got the sleeves here, and this stack is the skirt with a couple of different skirt options. We're going to start by cutting out the 4-way stretch black fabric. We're going with the bodice front first, which I'm cutting on a fold so it ends up a solo piece on the front. I don't want any seams on the front, so we're going to lay that pattern piece on the fold. I'm using weights just because it's a lot easier than pinning it all on. All right, so I'm adding that seam allowance and then cutting all the way around, adding a little bit to the length of each of these bodices. My faithful cat Winksy is here to get in my way and keep me company. Finishing all of these pieces that I'm using with this 4-way stretch lycra. So we've got our sleeves, we've got our front and back pieces, and our panty piece. Now we're moving on to that mesh, and I'm going to cut out those accent pieces that I'm going to use around the collar. Then we're going to get started on the skirt. I've never liked how full this skirt is, so you always cut it down a little bit so it's not quite so full around the hips. Now it's time to start assembling the panty. This is my least favorite part of making a skating dress, so I always get started with it first. So we're going to do the panty, the skirt, and the elastic. So let's start with pinning that skirt together. So this is the back of the skirt. I'm going to find those side seams. Now I have my skirt side pieces. I'm going to line those seams up, excuse me, Winksy, and start pinning. Okay, so I have my complete skirt ready to sew together. Now I'm going to pin those two panty pieces together at the side seams and the underseam. Now we're going to head to my serger and stitch all of those seams together. All right, now I'm moving to my more traditional sewing machine. I'm going to apply the elastic to the panty. This, again, is my least favorite part of making a skating dress, so I always try to get it out of the way first. There's a top side and a bottom side to this, so you gotta make sure that the seam is the side you're looking at when you sew. So you check the fabric, make sure the side seams are facing up, and then we're gonna just fold that fabric around the elastic, and then we're gonna tuck that in there and stick it underneath the presser foot. I'll give myself a couple of anchor stitches first. And then I start stretching that elastic so that as I sew, it will scrunch up the leg hole. It's always so great to have that elastic done. It feels like the rest of the dress is more fun than that elastic. So now we're going to pin together the skirt and the panty at the top edge, and we're going to stitch them together. This makes it a lot easier than when you go to attach it to the bodice. So we're going to sew that seam, making sure we don't trim any fabric off. We'll save the fabric trimming at the top edge for when I attach it to the bodice. So the skirt and panty are done. It's time to put the bodice together. So we're going to start pinning that illusion neckline on. So we have a front illusion piece that pins the front bodice, and then we have two back illusion pieces that stitch the back, that get pinned and stitched to the back bodice. Now we're going to go ahead and stitch those seams back on the serger machine. My first time making this dress, I didn't have a serger. I just had a traditional machine from the 1950s. It was an old black Singer, and all it did was stitch forward. So when I sewed, I had to really stretch the seams so that when I put it on and my body moved around, those seams didn't snap. It's so much easier now to make a skating dress that I have the proper tools. So now I'm going to put a collar onto the top of my dress. So I'm folding that collar in half and pinning the raw edges to that illusion neckline. Heading back to the serger, and we're going to finish that collar seam. Now it's time to assemble the sleeves. Pin those seams together and then stitch. Now we're going to attach the sleeve to the bodice. I'm going to turn that sleeve inside out so I have our nice side. And then I'm going to turn the bodice inside out. That way we can have our nice sides facing each other. Nothing worse than accidentally sewing a seam with one side facing the correct way and the other side inside out. So we always sew seams with what we call right sides together. Now we're going to sew those sleeve holes onto the bodice. We're almost done with the bodice at this point. All right, so our bodice is pretty much assembled. Let's flip it over, and looks like we need to do something with this back seam. it's time for that invisible zipper. I'm going back to my traditional sewing machine, and I have a special invisible zipper sewing foot on this that helps me get really close to the zipper feet. That way, when I turn the dress right side out, it just looks like a seam and we don't see any visible zipper there. Now, while we're on this machine, we're going to finish the sleeve holes. So I'm going to turn that seam over, do a nice little zigzag stitch, then I grab my oval elastic. I'm going to make a little loop and stitch it into the point at the very end of this sleeve hole. Now we have a nice finished sleeve that's going to hook over my middle finger. All right, so we have one final thing to do on this bodice, and that is a little bit of hand stitching here on the top of the zipper to hide those zipper tabs. So I've got a needle and thread with a knot at the end, and we're just gonna fold those tabs over and do some hand stitching to anchor them in place. Now it's time to put the bodice and the skirt together. So we have one last seam here assembling the two parts of the dress that we put together. This dress is now all sewn. It's time for the final pizzazz. We've got our crystals, we've got our wax tip pickup tool, we've got E6000, which is the only glue that I will use to apply crystals. I put it into a craft syringe, which makes it really nice and precise when I try to apply the glue for these crystals. Then I take a piece of cardboard that I've covered with packing tape. This gives it kind of a non-stick surface. I've put it inside my dress and I'm zipping that dress up. The reason I want that cardboard in there is that when I apply the glue and the crystals, the two layers of dress don't stick together. Now we're just gonna start applying little drops of glue wherever I want those crystals to sit. Since the original dress had sequin trim around this lower part of the neckline, that's where I'm going to start applying crystals. So I've got my glue on there. Now I'm going to start picking them up with my wax tip pickup tool and applying those right onto the droplets of glue. Now I have a whole tutorial for how to apply crystals. If you'd like to learn more about how to apply crystals, check out the link that I'm going to put down below in the description of this video. Again, all of these crafting supplies for applying crystals, I will put links to down below so you can get your own supplies for when you're ready to decorate your own skating outfit. This is the really fun part of doing a dress. The assembly is all done. Now it's time to make it look beautiful. So I've got crystals all around the hip line where my trim was on my old dress and around the neckline. The dress is done. It turned out really well. I'm so happy with how it looks. Looking at it, it's very nostalgic. I feel like it's like looking at an old prom dress or something, and it's just lots of memories associated with this dress. It was really special to be in my first competition, and so to have the dress back is so exciting. So I did add one line of crystals around the neck. That's the only extra thing that wasn't on the original dress. So the original dress had that sequin trim around the neckline on the lower side, and then it had sequins around the bottom. And you can see it a lot more easily. When I move the dress, you can see how all of those crystals, even though they're black, they throw a lot of light around. We are going to actually learn the choreography that goes with this program. So back in June, we watched together my original skating program, and I promised you I would teach you the choreography. Well, we are going to do that next week. So I have the dress. I've been practicing that choreography. Next week, come back because I'm going to be teaching you the choreography to my first ever skating competition so you guys can go out and learn that skating program with me. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give us that thumbs up. And if you haven't done so yet, then hit that subscribe button and the little notification bell down in the corner so you can see all my videos when they come out. Happy skating, and I look forward to seeing you next week.